let's all be respectful of people's views. This is a safe, respectful space, and we're obviously talking about a subject that's close to all our hearts. So Jan, we'll now start with the message that Chris Packham has sent us, and then after that I'll invite Catriona to speak. So Jan, over to you, or over to Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I'll be playing Chris Packham's message. It's not very loud, so you may want to put your settings on as loud as possible if you can't hear Chris as best as the video is recorded. I'm going to play that now.
Hi, Jan.
Jan, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Try to unmute yourself.
Sorry, could no one hear it in that case?
No, there was no sound coming through.
Okay, let me try again then.
Hello, Chris Packham here. I hope you're having a great weekend. Considering the value of Greenbelt and thinking very hard and carefully about how we can ensure that it's looked after. And also, I hope, educating people to its real value. And I speak as someone who grew up just inside a belt of green, and I used to belt off to that belt of green as soon as I possibly could, on the edge of the city where I lived. Greenbelt, as you know, you don't need me to tell you, is an enormously valuable resource, particularly for people in urban and suburban areas. It acts as a buffer, of course, between the city and perhaps other parts of the landscape. It acts as a repository for an enormous amount of life, which can prosper in cities and suburbia and in the countryside. It's almost what we call an ecocline, and therefore it can be even richer in life. It's an extraordinarily valuable resource for the people who are able to access it like I did when I was a kid, because it offers some respite from concrete. It is a green belt. Parts of it remain green, and being in that green means that you can calm down, de-stress, and it will improve your mental health. If you're active there, it will improve your physical health too. And then there's the physical nature of those spaces. They can alleviate flooding because they're not concrete. It's not all going to flash off when it rains and fill the drains. It could be, land which can soak up those onrushes of water which we have these days. So it offers what we call landscape resilience as well. I think that when the idea of Greenbelt was put together, it was a good one. And many people over the years have fought very hard to protect bits of it. But now we seem to be needing to fight, essentially all of it because of changes in our planning laws and planning plans. you know, I don't think we're going to build our way out of this recession. I think we need to think our way out of it by changing our minds to do creative things. And one of those has to be to preserve those parts of our landscape which are increasingly important for a diminishing, you know, wildlife, and an increasing number of people who want access to that wildlife and that nature. So, you know, all I can say to you is fight as hard as you possibly can to protect it. But there will be thousands of other people across the UK who will do the same when they are called upon, because it's a resource which is not only valuable for all the reasons that I've mentioned, it's also one which is very much loved by generations of people. And as a consequence of that, there's a sense of ownership. It's something which we probably don't own the deeds to, the title to. But I would say that we own a right to a quality of life which, you know, is fueled by our capacity to, you know, access green space, our green belt. Before I go, I'd just like to say happy birthday to Jan as well. A great weekend. I hope this last ball with wonderful vegan cake, which I would have liked to have shared with you had I been able to be there.
Well said, Chris, and happy birthday to Jan from me as well. So thanks to Chris for sending us that. And any points that any good points that Chris has, you know, the many good points that Chris has made there. Perhaps we can reflect on some of those in the subsequent discussion. Before we get to that, then could I now hand over to Catriona to tell us to give us a few words about some aspects of this topic we're discussing this afternoon. Catriona.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I get to do the boring planning bit, so apologies for that. I'm going to try and make it really exciting, but that, as you will appreciate, is very, very hard, especially on a late Friday afternoon. So forgive me. So I'm going to just do a few slides background around local plans and basically how Greenbelt fits into all of this, just to provide a little bit of context for you all before Rich and others talk more detailed about the Greenbelt and the Metropolitan Greenbelt, which is the one I think most people are particularly interested in this. So if you bear with me, I will share my slide. And I'm hoping you can all see that. Yes, thumbs up.
Yeah, it's good.
Yep, excellent, thank you. Hopefully. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to cover a couple of slides really about the basics around local plans and some of the sort of the basics around housing and how it all works together. And I will keep it fairly high level, but there's an opportunity obviously later for anybody that's got any specific questions to ask me anything you want, and I will do my best to answer it. And then I'll talk a little about some of the issues as I see it around Greenbelt, and some of the sort of the challenges that we've got. So in terms of the local plan and starting with the basics, and I'm assuming most of you have an interest in Surrey, so I will keep it sort of Surrey focused. Local plans are prepared by what we call local planning authorities, which is the districts and boroughs in Surrey. So we've got, I think, representatives from Spelthorne, probably Runnymede and Elmbridge on this call tonight. So there's 11 districts in Surrey and they all have their own responsibility for preparing their local plan. It is supposed to be a spatial interpretation of how your area is going to develop. So basically it sets out for the next 10, 15 years what you're trying to change in your area and how you're going to change it. And it is, I put that point about it not being an appropriate strategy, but not the most appropriate, because up until recently, through the testing process, there was an ability to actually say, this is a better strategy, this is a better way of doing things. In actual fact, this is the local authorities, the local planning authorities' plan. It is their interpretation and nobody else's that is getting taken forward. It will set out policies and it has a number of maps that help local planning authorities to determine planning applications, and that includes how many new homes are going to be built over this period and where they should be built. It's supposed to be a reflection of the council's overall vision, and I put the word supposed to be because I work with a lot of local planning authorities providing advice on their plans, and to be honest, not a lot of them are vision based. A lot more increasingly are more what I would call housing plans, so they're basically taking a number and trying to fit it in rather than setting a long-term vision for a place. As back to that point about how you want your area to grow, what needs to change, how you want it to adapt, and equally how you want it to respond around some of the big issues around things like climate change. And there's 2 stages at which local planning authorities are legally obliged to consult their local communities, and we call them Regulation 18 stage and Regulation 19 stage. You may have heard people talk about Reg 18 and Reg 19, that is what they are referring to. However, I think the best local authorities engage with their local communities on an ongoing basis from start to finish. That should be the norm, not the exception, but I think with increasingly around resources and things like that have an impact on it, but it should be a much more continuous involvement of local communities than it probably is in a lot of places. Local plans are prepared by the local planning authority, but they are also a legal document, so they have to be subject to some form of scrutiny, and that is in this case done by the planning inspector from the planning inspectorate, but it is a independent planning inspector that actually tests them, not the planning inspectorate as a whole. It is one person, or in some cases 2 people, that actually have that role. And their role is to make sure that the plan is legally compliant and technically sound. And they have a number of tests of soundness, as we call them, in which the plan is actually tested. And again, I put that there around the judgment as to whether a plan is sound or not is a planning judgment. And I think one of the takeaways, I think, for anybody that gets involved in planning is that it is about judgments. It's about political judgments, professional judgments, a whole load of judgments. There is very little in it that is actually legally set down in law. So that's a really important point, because obviously everybody has a different view of things, and that comes down to also the evidence that is used to support a local plan. If you go to one consultancy to get evidence developed, and it could be your Greenbelt review, you might get a very different approach from another consultancy. They have a different they may make different judgment calls. So that is really important. I've put that link there to the challenge against Guildford Borough Council from 2019 against their local plan. It is a wealth of information. It's quite long, but there is a huge amount in there in terms of just views of the lawyers about how things actually play out in the system, particularly around issues around the Greenbelt. So how does the Greenbelt fit in? I think probably anybody that's had any involvement in local planning where in Surrey has come up against this, and there's 5 main purposes, and I won't read them out, but they are all sitting there. But they are mutually exclusive. They are not, you don't have to tick all these boxes. You just need to tick one of them in terms of how Greenbelt is applied. But the most important point about Greenbelt is it is not an environmental designation. It is a policy tool. It was there to help to prevent sprawl, and in the Metropolitan Greenbelt's case, it was there to prevent London coalescing with its surrounding areas, but it's there to prevent urban areas from joining up together. So it has a very specific purpose, and it has, well, 5 very specific purposes. And I think that's, again, very important. It is not an environmental tool. It is not an environmental designation, although there is the issue around London about it being the green lung of London. The general extent of the Greenbelt, so, you know, you may make small changes, but the general coverage should be able to endure for a very long time. And I think it's only recently, over the last 10 years or so, that we've seen a lot more chipping away of greenbelt and a lot more continuous chipping away of greenbelt, and I think that's more to do with the way the planning system is set up now than it was before. But generally, once the greenbelt has been fixed, it should be able to endure, but that means the local planning authority also has to try and look 15 years ahead and make sure that the plan is resilient and that you don't need to make any changes to deal with some issues around growth particularly. One of the key issues, and again, I'm sure there's plenty of you on this call that have come up against this, is around how a local plan deals with its housing needs, which are set down initially by government, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute, and basically whether you need to use greenbelt because you can't fit your full needs within the existing urban areas, and in places like Surrey, 74% of Surrey is greenbelt, so you are very heavily constrained in terms of your options, and this has been where there has been sort of more, I guess, most of the challenges with local communities around using greenbelt and whether the case has properly been made by the local planning authority. But all options have to be fully explored, and there has been some local authorities, Brighton, although it's not greenbelt, had very significant constraints because of the national, South Downs National Park and the Channel, but it still had to go back several times and demonstrate that it had explored absolutely every rabbit hole before it got away with saying, no, we don't need to meet our needs in full. And there's others like Birmingham where they didn't have to meet their needs in full because they had the evidence to back it up. So you will be tested against this, but local authorities have to look down every possible, look for every opportunity to basically meet their housing needs in full before even starting to consider whether they move into the greenbelt. Changes to greenbelt boundaries have to be managed through the local plan process, and although there are, you'll see that last point there, you can change the greenbelt boundary through planning applications where very special circumstances have been justified. That is a much harder test to meet. Most changes have to be done through the local plan process, and the local authority have to decide that there are exceptional circumstances and evidence the exceptional circumstances to do that. Now, I think up until about 2011, we had, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we had a planning system that was much more restrictive in how greenbelt is used. I think we've got a much more flexible system now in the way that greenbelt is used, and a much more flexible system that allows local planning authorities to justify it through exceptional circumstances. And you'll see in the box there, setting housing numbers. This is a very, very short summary of a very long, complicated process that basically the government sets out its housing targets for each local planning authority through a methodology that is standard right across the country. These are what we technically call policy off targets, so they're basically assessments of housing needs, but they then have to have all your other policies applied. And again, an important point of a local plan is not one, individual policies cannot be dealt with in isolation. You have to look at a local plan as a whole. Every policy has to be seen as part of that wider context. You can't just pick out the policy you like and deal with it in that way. So what happens with the number is that local planning authorities are then supposed to test that against national policies, and that includes greenbelt, but other things like areas of outstanding natural beauty and things like that, and look at whether they can accommodate their needs in full. At that point, if they are surrounded by greenbelt and that is their only option, they can then consider whether to use greenbelt. But they have to do a very clear cost-benefit analysis to look at whether the benefits of releasing greenbelt outweigh the costs. Now, if a local planning authority decides that the costs are too much to bear for the loss of greenbelt, but they still can't meet their needs, and they have had conversations with adjoining local authorities through what we call the duty to cooperate, and they can't help them out, then they can still put a case forward to an examination to basically say that they can't meet their needs in full. There's nowhere else it can go, and therefore their local plan target, once all the policies have been applied, is going to be less than what the government's expectation is. If, however, they make a case for exceptional circumstances, so if a local planning authority says, look, actually the housing needs in this area are so great that they outweigh anything else, and therefore we need to make a case to use some of our greenbelt, and they have made the exceptional circumstances case, then that is a moment when an inspector can then say, an inspector cannot make the case for exceptional circumstances. And this, again, is a really important point. Only the local planning authority can determine whether exceptional circumstances exist or not. But if they do make that case, then at a local plan examination, an inspector has within it his or her rights to test alternative greenbelt sites against the ones chosen by the local planning authority, and to ask for more. And well, when Hatfield up in Hertfordshire is in its 4th year of examination, I think it's probably the longest local plan examination ever, and they have throughout that process done I think the minimum of 5 different reviews of the greenbelt to keep squeezing more land out of the greenbelt. And the inspector can do that because the local planning authority has made that case for exceptional circumstances. Where a local planning authority doesn't make that case, and back to that point where the cost benefit analysis says actually the costs of losing greenbelt are too great to endure, therefore we're just not going to be able to meet our needs, an inspector cannot require them to use greenbelt, but the inspector can ask them to go back and look again. And again with Brighton, although it wasn't greenbelt, it was a similar scenario. They had to go back several times with more evidence to come back and say, look, we have looked down every rabbit hole, we've exhausted every other option, we're not going to use greenbelt, it's too important for X, Y, and Z reasons, therefore, you know, this is our strategy, this is the plan that we want. So just finishing off with some of the key issues as I see it. One of the key points about greenbelt is that it was always supposed to be a strategic planning tool. And what I mean by that is it was supposed to be managed on a much bigger scale than individual districts and boroughs. The metropolitan greenbelt around London is not London's greenbelt, is not Surrey's greenbelt, is not Elmbridge's greenbelt, it is the greenbelt for the city region. And it should, any changes to that have always up until 2012 been managed at that sort of at a strategic level where you have options, and that's linked very much to that second bullet point. Greenbelt is a policy of restriction, but it was part of it's a 2-part policy because the idea was to restrict growth in certain areas where it's not appropriate for the greenbelt reasons, but to promote growth in areas that could be delivered better. So new towns, for example, were the growth areas, and then more recently through what we called the South East Plan, which was a regional strategy for the South East. There was areas like Milton Keynes and Aylesbury and South Hampshire and places like that where they took extra housing to meet the overall needs of the region in order to allow areas of greenbelt to continue with their constraint policy. But we don't have that mechanism anymore. The duty to cooperate was its replacement, and the government has now said it's going to replace the duty and hopefully bring something better to manage this. And as a result of that, every single local planning authority has had to do a greenbelt review, and in most cases local planning authorities are looking at losing some part of their greenbelt because they have decided there are exceptional circumstances. So one of the points I made earlier on about lack of vision, I think we are increasingly seeing planning by numbers, and what I mean by that is local plans basically having the government's number and trying to see how it can fit it in, rather than starting with that strategy, that long-term vision, and saying this is what we want to achieve and this is how the housing fits in, this is what we want for the greenbelt, and allow that proper testing of greenbelt. Structure plans, some of you will remember before regional strategies and regional strategies, we had the Surrey structure plan, and then we had the South East plan, which were the strategic planning documents for Surrey. The general view was that the green belt within the M25 was the most fragmented, it was the most vulnerable and the most under pressure, and has always been. And in some parts you have one field, you know, acting as strategic green belt, separating communities because of that fragmentation. The last structure plan, the South East plan, took the view that if you were going to protect green belt and you were going to have, although there wasn't a deliberate attempt to categorise green belt, but the view was you don't touch the green belt within the M25 because you are talking about very small areas that play really important parts. So there are arguments about green belt being unsustainable. It makes people leap over the green belt and therefore it's not sustainable. I totally disagree with that argument, I think, and I think we will see it become a less of an argument as more people live more locally, work more locally again, because of our sort of COVID experience. But I think also the further away you are, the more likely you are to use public transport than the closer you are into London. And you know, I live in Elbridge, and there is far more people using their cars to get to work than people who travel in from Guildford, for example, into London. They tend to use the train rather than drive. So I don't agree that it's unsustainable, but I know there are a lot of other arguments countering that. The point that Greenbelt is not an environmental policy is important, but I think we now need to start thinking about the Greenbelt in a different way. And again, one of the challenges we face constantly, that sort of penultimate point, is that there's a lot of Greenbelt, especially around London, that's, you know, tatty bits of land that, you know, it has no offer to anybody. It's not accessible. It's not very particularly green. And I think we now need to, in terms of climate change, in terms of health and well-being, again, in terms of our recent COVID experience and access to green spaces, I think we need to reimagine the green belt, and I think we need to overlay it with a lot more green infrastructure. And if there are poor quality areas of green belt, instead of saying they're poor quality, let's build on them, why not open them up? Why not improve the quality and actually start looking at it in a different way? Just because something's not accessible doesn't mean it doesn't fulfill some form of really important function. So I do think we need to start rethinking Greenbelt and reimagining how it is. And if government are going to review it, I think that's one of the areas that they should particularly look at. And it's interesting to see that the London plan, the London plan specifically now says that one of the policies is to enhance the green belt to provide appropriate multifunctional beneficial uses. And I think that's how we should be viewing the green belt outside London, not just in London. And I'll finish with London, because I think the challenges in terms of the growth of the city are immense. London is not meeting its housing need as it is. It has just got a new London plan over the line, but there is a very clear steer from government that the mayor will have to review it very soon, and that they will have to work much more closely with its neighbouring authorities to meet current needs, housing needs, but also that London, alongside a number of other cities across England, have been given an extra 35% uplift in housing numbers. So even more new housing will have to be provided. Now, there isn't necessarily an expectation that that will come across the border into places like Surrey, but there does need to be some sort of much more proactive and effective way of managing that. And interestingly, there was some last-minute amendments to the London plan made by the Secretary of State to allow the London plan to reallocate industrial and employment land, even if it's in current use for housing, and if the alternative is to use Greenbelt or metropolitan open land. So, you know, I think the government recognise how important Greenbelt is, but I think they also recognise that there are some real challenges to protect that and meet the housing needs that this country so desperately needs to address. And I think that would be me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catriona. A lot of material there for us to be reflecting on. I'll resist the temptation right now to comment or ask any questions. I mean, the one thing, because we'll move on to Richard's presentation shortly, and we'll come back to that obviously later. So everybody, please bear in mind any questions or thoughts that inspires with you, and we'll come back to that after we view the next two presentations. I mean, the one immediate thought that comes to my mind is, I really wish, from my experience, I really wish a lot of local councils could hear all those points. I strongly suspect there's a lot of councillors and a lot of officers are not aware of that material. So I thought that was excellent information. So thank you for that. I'd now like to move on to Richard from London's Greenbelt Council. Richard, can I hand the floor over to yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Catriona, for that introduction. I have to say it's a delight to be on a panel with Catriona. She's one of the few I have, unfortunately, planning experts who really understands the Green Belt and the system of planning for it. And I think the point you made, Chris, just now about councillors understanding it, they should all be forced to listen to her on regular intervals so they understand exactly what it's all about. I'm not sure she'll thank me for that, but there we are. Okay, I'm going to now go into this. Wait a minute, I've got to find out. There we are. The London Greenbelt Council, well, you've been introduced to it, so I'm not going to say any more about it. All I would say is we don't support any political party. We are an apolitical organisation. I was asked to deal with the following, and I added the fifth one on there. What's happening to London's Green Belt? How is planning policy being applied? How are local authorities and residents responding? What can local authorities do to protect the Green Belt and a positive future for London's Green Belt, which is my addition. So what's happening to the London Green Belt? Well, this is a chart showing the developments and likely housing in the London Green Belt in 2016. And I'm now going to show you what it was in 2020. As you see, there's been a massive increase in developments within the London Green Belt. And you'll also spot from that, there are certain areas which are suffering more than others. And I'll come on to why that is the case later on. We produce every year a report called Safe Under Us. And I'm now going to take you through some of the things that were in there. Currently, there are plans to build nearly 250,000 houses in the London Green Belt, and that's since 2016. The number of sites earmarked is up 211%. The three counties most badly hit so far are Essex, Hertfordshire and Surrey. And we're expecting further loss of green belt in their local plans as they go on. Inspectors at local plan reviews insisting on green belt reviews, and although Catriona quite rightly pointed out they don't have a right to do so, they appear to be doing so, whatever. And we go to councillors who are keen to profess their keenness for protection of the green belt, but have allowed planning officers and local plan inspectors to override their wishes. The threats to London Greenbelt are widespread. There are 66 local planning authorities in the London Greenbelt, and 78% of those are actually envisaging development in the Greenbelt. There is no overall strategy for the London Metropolitan Greenbelt, and again, Catriona referred to this, and this is a great weakness. There should be a strategy. And there is currently no overall mechanism for the community, the cumulative impact, and of course, resulting in loss of land for important food production, recreation, and mental health benefits. There's no overall strategic body. the planning policy appears to be ineffective in implementing control of development in the green belt. We've got exceptional circumstances, but the interpretation of that is very different depending on which of the 66 districts you're talking about. And there's this business about failure to meet housing targets, which goes on continuously. And once again, exceptional circumstances. We're not providing affordable homes, and I'll deal with that in greater detail later on. We're actually providing 4 and 5 bedroom low density housing in the London Greenbelt when it's being allowed to be built. And a lot of those settlements are not on public transport, so they're really unsustainable. We published data on brownfield land, and I'm going to show you a bit about that later on. And there is sufficient brownfield land to actually make 250,000 homes. So that would mean no green belt was needed whatsoever. And we're slightly concerned over the 5-year planning cycle because we're concerned that every time the planning cycle occurs, then more London's green belt is going to be lost. Well, how is planning policy being applied? I'm going to talk about the 5 areas there: green belt reviews, brownfield, affordable, densities, and sustainable. Green belt reviews, are they obligatory? No, they're not. An inspector can only consider green belt if the local authority put it forward in their report to him. And that's the only way it can be done. And it's got to, and there's also with greenbelt reviews, there are 5 purposes, and the greenbelt doesn't have to abide by those 5 purposes. But if you see a greenbelt review, it will say, oh, well, it's only got 2 of the 5 or something of that ilk. Greenbelt review can conclude that no greenbelt land should be identified for removal, but I haven't seen one yet. But I believe that that's important, and that we ought to get realistic about that. And it's only by submitting a local plan that suggests greenbelt that the inspector can consider it. This is a quote from the Secretary of State in 2018. Planning inspectors cannot enforce greenbelt releases onto authorities. Inspectors can only recommend changes to plans that have been submitted for examination where the plan would otherwise be found unsigned, and if requested to do so by the authority. That's my underlining. Para 137 of the National Planning Policy Framework is there, and there you will see they've got to examine fully all other reasonable options, and there is very little evidence that that is happening. Brandon Lewis, when he was Housing Minister, said, we have repeatedly made clear that demands for housing alone will not change greenbelt boundaries. And that's another piece of information which is important. And Jake Berry, when he took over as Minister, said the NPPF is clear, and last year we strengthened the greenbelt policy in the revised NPPF. And so he did. So why don't we have a brownfield review? We have a greenbelt review, why don't we have a brownfield review? And are brownfield registers comprehensive? And I think you'll find that very few of them are, if any. Are brownfield registers up to date? They're supposed to be up to date by the government's edict, and yet a lot of them aren't. They're over a year out of date, and they need to be brought up. We ought to consider higher densities in brownfield land, and we also ought to include empty homes, because there's quite a lot of those in the London area. This is an exercise that was done by those organisations there: London CPRE, Enfield Road Watch, and the Enfield Society. And as you see, they had concerns about it, so they did their own research and their own analysis. Those were the things that they were concerned about. And you can see they came up, the Enfield district said that they had enough brownfield land for 2,700 homes. And this report shows there's enough brownfield land for 36,000 homes. Now, that may be slightly optimistic, and you may be able to go through it and find perhaps some errors in there. but certainly it's probably in the region of 10 to 20,000 homes that are available in brownfield land in the London Borough of Enfield. So let's talk about densities, because that's very important, and that's part of the discussion and what was put forward by Enfield. The two highest density cities in the UK are Edinburgh and Bath. Why? Because they have terraced housing, and that is easily the most dense housing there is. They're about 60 homes per hectare, as is some of the nice Georgian squares in the London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And those houses go for about £2 million each, so they can't be that unattractive. This is an idea of a modern high density housing area which could be erected on brownfield land. This is 100 homes per hectare, and as you can see, it's been designed in a way which makes it attractive and nice to live in. This is another example where housing is round a main square in the centre, if you like, following the Georgian example in Kensington and Chelsea. And this is an area, again in Enfield, where social housing has gone up, and you will notice that most of these places are 1 and 2 bedroom houses for starter families to take over. And it just shows you the sort of thing that can work. And it's, as I say, dedicated to social housing, for which there's a great need. Affordable, well, in the London Greenbelt area, we have very little or no evidence of any of those 250 homes at the moment being affordable. And even affordable is 80% of market value. And when you're talking about 80% of market value as far as London's concerned, you're still talking about an amount beyond most people's being able to afford. And development in the London Greenbelt is mostly 4 and 5 bedroom low density housing. Why? Because developers can make the most profit on those. Many of the sites are not sustainable because they're not on transport routes. They're car dependent. And you may have heard that Siobhan Donner put forward the view that we should build around railway stations in the Greenbelt. That's fine for the person who's working in London, but the rest of the family will have to use the car for any infrastructure that they need, like schools and doctor surgeries, etc. If you then add the infrastructure to the settlement you're doing, you'll probably double or could be 2.5 times the amount of land and Greenbelt land that you're going to need. So how are local authorities and residents responding? Well, many of the sites proposed won't be on public transport routes. I'm sorry, let's go on. How are they doing it? Well, I've got here a list of some London authorities. Sevenoaks has taken it to the High Court and lost, and they took it to the Appeal Court and lost. They're now going to the Secretary of State and saying, can you please tell us what we now do next? Tunbridge and Morling is doing exactly the same. Decorum have just withdrawn their local plan because of a lot of antipathy from local residents. Three Rivers were going to build on the Greenbelt, and they were going to take large areas of the Greenbelt, but their fellow councillors decided that the leader wasn't leading them correctly, and so she was dismissed, and they've now got a new leader. Guildford, in the last local council elections, went from being a 30 majority to the majority party to no overall control. Waverley went from even more, I think it was near a 40 majority, and they went to no overall control. Tunbridge Wells lost its leader last time, and I spoke at a meeting there where there were 400 people who were concerned about losing their Greenbelt. And once again, the person organising that meeting asked who in the hall thought that their local councillor was supporting them, and no hands went up. Uttlesford, last in 2019, changed hands from the ruling group to a residents group, which is now in charge there and attempting to change their local plan. Tandridge, in the last 3 elections, has got the leader of the council, and every time the resident put up against them is getting double the votes that the leader gets. And Bracknell Forest, because of, again, an area where I went down to a meeting where there was about 300 people there, Bracknell Forest, the residents have campaigned so well that they've reduced the amount of building in the Greenbelt from 4,000, which was being originally suggested, to 2,000. That, of course, is still too much, but they're continuing to battle. So what can local authorities do to protect the green belt? Well, question the housing figures in the district. Use the 2018 ONS figures. The 2014 figures at present used by the government, the ONS has already admitted that those are incorrect, mainly because it was soon after the time when divorce was made that much easier, and there were a lot more households as a result of that. That figure wasn't going to be replicated in the following years. And as I say, 2016, the figures went down. 2018, they've gone down further. It needs to be taken into account, too, that we've had 1 million immigrations since the Brexit. The other thing is resist a greenbelt review. If you want to protect your greenbelt, don't have a greenbelt review. Carry out a comprehensive brownfield review. There's a lot more brownfield out there than most local authorities are aware of. Look at higher densities. What a lot of local authorities are doing at the moment is waiting to see what happens to the Planning Act. Because one of the things that the Planning Act is suggesting is that the duty to cooperate will disappear. And when that does, that'll make planning authorities, give them a better chance of being able to move forward on a more realistic plan. Encourage local community to get involved. This is very, very important. Where there have been strong residents and community involvement, this has made a difference. Listen to the consultation response. See what consultation happens. Make sure that the response includes the points that have been put forward. And local authorities ought to, as I say, listen very carefully to that. And where they haven't, residents have got very upset, quite rightly. And local authorities, instead of acting independent, should act as a group to say, I'm sorry, these housing figures are just far too high and we cannot realistically accommodate them. And finally, very quickly, in November 2019, the London Greenbelt Council produced this positive vision for London's Green Belt. And we looked at COVID and the effect that it's had on people wanting to get out into the countryside. We've looked at its importance of climate change, sequestration, hedges, and trees. And those of you who heard the programme today, the 39 ways in which we can improve the climate, we can improve climate change with Tom Heap, will know that they did farmland today and showed how much carbon farmland can absorb when it's handled in the proper way. Clean water and also flooding. It prevents flooding. It's got a very important job to play there. It has very attractive landscape, and I totally agree with Catriona that if the landscape isn't very attractive, then let's spend some money on it and make it attractive. It's got an important role with biodiversity, and anybody who is, if you like, investigating biodiversity will know that it's got to have corridors, and the Greenbelt provides that, and it can provide more in the future. Tree planting and hedging. Access is very, very important to the Greenbelt. It provides recreation. Farmers told me down in Surrey when I met them that one of their problems they have at weekends is they can't get the tractor out the gate because there are so many cyclists. Health and well-being, well, one of the things we had in our report was how it contributed to health and well-being and how important it was for it. And the economic benefit, well, if you can save money on health aspects by giving health and well-being with the Greenbelt, then that must be important for the economy. So those are the things which I was asked to do, and those are what I've covered. And then finally, our recommendations. We need a strategic body for London's Green Belt, like in Ontario in Canada, which is very good and a very good example. We need to develop a 25-year strategic plan. We need to protect Green Belt boundaries. We need to look at Brownfield first, far more strongly and stringently than we're doing at the moment. We need to get a definition of exceptional circumstances, which everybody can understand, and not necessarily what it can be, but what it shouldn't be. We need to enhance and conserve the Green Belt, and we need to encourage far more access, especially for youngsters in the centre of London, who desperately need to get out into the countryside in order to appreciate it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for a fascinating presentation. And in the same way that I felt that many councillors and local authorities should see what Catriona was saying earlier. Equally, I think but also communities and residents should be listening to your messages that you just shared with us and in your excellent presentation. And also, I would urge people in this session this afternoon to actually look on the London Greenbelt Council website and have a look at the report, and the report you specifically mentioned there, Positive Vision, which includes lots of very helpful information. Thank you very much for that, Richard. And now I'll just move on finally from our panel to Jan Doerfel, who will tell us a few perhaps more local issues, but some other aspects that haven't been covered to date. And then after that, we will move on to some discussion. Jan, I'll give the floor to yourself.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much to Richard and Catriona for this really helpful outline. I'd like to explain a little bit sort of where I'm coming from. So I live in Spelthorne. In 2019, I thought, well, really, I need to do something more about climate change. And so I decided to stand as a Green Party councillor. Surprisingly, I was voted into Spelthorne Borough Council for the District of Staines. And literally in May 2019, in June, we realized through word of mouth that there was a consultation ongoing on protected urban open spaces. It hadn't been shared really with any residents. I think a handful of groups were sort of in the know. A couple of chosen residents associations, it appears. I asked for the exact list of who was told about it. I wasn't given the list even. So that was a consultation which was building on an earlier consultation. So basically the year before, the council had done an issues and options consultation, basically saying to people, where should we build? But it wasn't an open question. I think there were 4 options and people were told in no uncertain terms, if you don't like any of them, choose the one you dislike least. So nothing about what Catriona was saying about having a vision, asking people what they want for the area they live in. It was pretty much take those 4 or to totally stuff it. So one of the questions in that issues and options consultation, and because there's also concerns green spaces, was, would you agree that we should consider protected urban open spaces as local green spaces? Now, local green spaces is a legal definition that gives as much protection as the green belt. But the question and the background in the issues and options consultation on the green spaces was, the gist was, if you read it, the council was saying, oh, previous designations of protected urban open spaces haven't protected that green space enough. It's been released anyway. So shall we consider it for the local green space designation? But what it didn't say is, shall we choose it for the local green space designation? So it was a fantastic way to give people the impression that by saying yes, that they would get higher protection, not lesser. And some people wrote in and said, I don't really know what that question means. And that's absolutely true, because you couldn't answer the question without knowing the criteria. So in June, the criteria then came out, and I looked at it, and it was a points-based system. And I'm an immigration barrister, and I know points-based system from the Home Office. And I looked at it and I thought, this looks as if it's designed to refuse. So we sent someone out from the Green Party with a planning background who looked at 71 protected urban open spaces, the 71 we have in Spelthorne. And he used the points-based system that had been suggested by the consultants. And it showed that 70 out of 71 would fail it. Not by a small margin, by a huge margin. So it was clearly designed to strip the green spaces of protection. We then, if I may, share screen. Well, maybe it's disappeared. We then did a petition to protect the green spaces. I will show that one. If I can share the screen. The screen and I think it's not sharing. Anyway, I'll leave that. I'll put the link in the link in the chat. So we did a petition. We over a weekend we got about 2,000 to 2,500 signatures, and we got coverage in the local media. I then got a very angry phone call from the monitoring officer, basically saying, "How dare you waste our time? I've been elected at this point as a councillor. How dare we had to spend 2 days dealing with this newspaper article now in the Surrey Advertiser." We were subsequently summoned in front of the disciplinary committee, and that summoning sort of continued the request that we appear, etc., for months and months and months. Then came the Greenbelt decision. So Spelthorne Borough Council decided that they wanted to release 19 Greenbelt sites in their local plan. Now, when I joined the council, there were rumors about there's a local plan working group, but no one knew who was on it, nothing was published, and no one knew what was being discussed. And not even councillors were given access to those documents. So we started a petition to protect the Greenbelt, which I'll also post. We got over 6,600 signatures.
It's a meeting.
The council was then required.
The
could someone please? I think not everyone is muted. I think Ms. Thomas might not be muted, so there's a bit of a yes. Thank you. So yes, so we then collected so many signatures that it had to come before Spelthorne Borough Council as a decision. So at that decision, about a third of the councillors were absent, and of the remaining councillors that were there, a third, the leadership suggested, okay, rather than deciding to protect the Greenbelt there and then, we are asking for a second option, namely to keep the petition under review. So that petition, then there was a vote, and it turned out to be 50-50. So 50% voted to keep it under review. But of course, because the leading Conservatives had the majority and the mayor was Conservative, they had the casting vote. So it was refused. The decision was to keep it under review rather than, which the council could have done, is to protect all the Greenbelt from development in the local plan there and then. And that was split along party lines, so that all the opposition voting to protect the Greenbelt and all the Conservatives at the time, which didn't have any breakaway groups at the time, stating they wanted to keep it under review. Subsequently, I tried to introduce 4 Greenbelt motions, including one, I introduced one, I was then told that that wasn't actually lawful. I received legal advice from another barrister saying it's a perfectly lawful motion. But of course, if a council has money to instruct barristers, being a barrister, and you get instructed by council, if they want you to argue a certain point of view, they say, our point of view is X, please make an argument for point of view X. Your barrister will make an argument for point of view X. I mean, the point is, see it as a criminal trial. You have a defendant who's accused of drug smuggling, and as a former head of chambers once said, his argument is, whilst I was sleeping in the police cell, the police doctor came and stuffed the drugs up into my behind. Well, if that's your instruction as a barrister, you fight that. You tell your client, I don't think you'll win that one. The jury might just not believe it, but you put it forward. So in a way, the instructions went out to the council barrister for public money, of course, taxpayers' money, we're paying for that, to argue only one way, to say my motion is unlawful. It wasn't a question, do you think it might be lawful? Give us yes, no, give us an assessment of what you think. I then put forward 3 other motions, including one that my barrister had said is fine. She's a leading public law barrister. She said we worked on the And that was pursuant the discussion of the Greenbelt motion. We have now decided to protect all Greenbelt from release in the local plan. But to test them, and I put it in a very vague Greenbelt motion that Surrey County Council just passed years ago, and I was told that all 3 were unlawful, including one that was so vague there was really absolutely nothing unlawful about it. You know, they could have just said, well, you can put that one, but it won't help you either way. Well, they didn't. So they kind of tested them. Okay, so since then we've been unable to bring any further Greenbelt motions. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's not an issue of well, it is an issue of political will. And a lot of local authorities are, or certainly Spelthorne clearly has an interest in keeping the debate so focused on housing numbers and stopping either residents being consulted and informed or councillors having a free vote. Now, with a breakaway group from the leading Conservatives and this idea we now have a Conservative council that listens, we then had a new local plan task group, and the chair of that task, nothing wrong with our local plan, basically saying the pre-COVID local plan that seeks to release 19 Greenbelt sites is fine and I'm not intending to change it. And that's exactly our experience as members of that local plan task group. I mean, I would have loved to say, let's get Catriona, Riddell and Richard Knox-Johnston to be invited and talk. But whenever a council officer or another councillor says, yeah, but these housing numbers are mandatory compulsory numbers, and I keep saying, no, their starting point, I get shut down. And then I get told that actually, not that the Greenbelt release is the exception, but that it would be unlawful for us to protect the Greenbelt. So I'm being told as a barrister that the law doesn't mean the law, that the law means the absolute opposite. So, and that's the shocking statistics also from Richard, that 74%, no, sorry, that the 78% of the local planning authorities in the London Greenbelt are considering Greenbelt release. Now, Greenbelt release should only be happening in exceptional circumstances. So in a way, you need to argue for the exceptional circumstances. You don't have to argue against them. The norm should be Greenbelt release. And anyone who looks at the NPPF, the National Planning and Policy Framework, they will see that it says Greenbelt has been instituted to be permanent. So if your council says, oh, but we want to release Greenbelt, what they're saying is we are going to make a proactive case to release Greenbelt. It's not a default. They actually have to put effort into releasing Greenbelt. So that is really worrying. And what Richard and Catriona have both said is no planning inspector can force any local authority to release Greenbelt, which means if a local authority says, you know what, there are restrictions in the planning framework, and there's a footnote saying that Greenbelt policies can influence the scope of the numbers as well as the area where you put housing. So there is a clear justification there, and I've told Spelthorne Council that several times. You can rely on it, and no one can judicially review you to say yes, but you must. In a way, that's the strongest position you possibly could be in to actually protect all Greenbelt in your area from release. And what Catriona has said, once a local authority has made that decision to declare exceptional circumstances, it opens Pandora's box. Because even if you think, oh, my local site here next to me is safe, then the local inspector can say, oh no, there's another site over there that should be, that is more worthy of protection than yours. What you're getting is literally a civil war of one community group working against another, saying, please protect mine and not them, because ours is better. Our Greenbelt is better than theirs. What we want and what we need to protect all Greenbelt, from Campden Park to Stratton Road to Charlton Village, is to say that door needs to be closed. Because if all Greenbelt is protected, then my green belt is protected and no one can judicially review me, because even if a planning company with as much money as they have, they're unlikely to be successful. The other side of the argument is if a local authority decides to declare that there are exceptional circumstances, then as a resident, if you had all the money to do judicial review, you would have to prove, and these are what these public law principles are, that their decision is so unreasonable that no reasonable local authority could take it. You know, the hurdle is very, very high once they've taken a decision. You know, it means it has to be so absurd and illogical rather than just being unpopular, for example, or that they failed to take into account very important consideration and things like that. So in a way, you are on the back foot as a resident if you would try to judicially review a local authority decision, whereas they're on a strong footing, actually, if they took a decision to defend Greenbelt. Then the issue that Richard raised about Greenbelt reviews. The issue about Greenbelt reviews are that the big consultants are also in this area, Arup, etc. They will make up arbitrary criteria. Now, in law, Greenbelt is Greenbelt. It's got no weakly performing, moderately performing, strongly performing Greenbelt. Greenbelt is Greenbelt, and as Richard said, there are 5 criteria, but you by far don't have to fulfill all. If you fulfill one, that's fine. And of course, 2 of the criteria are that you're by preventing building on Greenbelt, you're forcing a local authority to look at Brownfield. So you're maximizing building on Brownfield, basically by saying you cannot build here. So that already fulfills one purpose. Second purpose, of course, is that you're stopping urban sprawl. So by saying you can't build here, you are actually stopping urban sprawl. So what the thing is with these Greenbelt assessments is, so you've got Arup, here in Surrey, saying we have developed the following criteria. They admit that their criteria is totally arbitrary, they've just made them up. And then you've got another consultant, let's say in the north of England, making up other criteria. So suddenly you have different criteria floating around in the country, one saying this is strongly performing, and another one saying no, on my criteria that would be moderately performing. Now in law, you cannot have that. I don't know whether anyone has ever challenged the comparison between different Greenbelt assessments across the country, but it's an anathema to even go there. And we cannot have private companies that obviously have a commercial interest in having results. If you were a consultant who comes back on every Greenbelt assessment saying it's all strongly performing, you cannot release a single Greenbelt site. I can tell you, you're not going to get many instructions after a while, are you? Because the idea behind these Greenbelt assessments is often that local authorities are saying, well, but we want to release X amount, and please tell us, where we can get away with doing it. So I totally agree with Richard there that having Greenbelt assessments is a really problematic issue. Of course, they cost a lot of money, so it's again taxpayers' money that could be spent on necessary project on flood prevention, climate change issues, biodiversity initiatives, and all that kind of thing. Furthermore, and that's an example from Elmbridge, you get an assessment like that back, and within a day you've got companies buying up Greenbelt that's been designed as weakly performing, because Greenbelt, once the Greenbelt designation is there and it's meant to be permanent, it's cheaper than Brownfield because you're not supposed to do anything with it, really. So what's the point of anyone buying it, apart from if you wanted to protect it? So there's a lot, if you looked at websites, speculation, a lot of people, you might buy a Greenbelt site, and if you're lucky and yours gets developed, you can have profit margins of 200,000%. It just depends on how much you bought it for then, and now suddenly it gets released. So, in terms of coming as close to winning the lottery as possible, some see it that way. So it's really problematic. And then when you have companies, and we have several here in Surrey and Spelthorne, that their strategy appears to be, let's build Greenbelt, and then let's test out the council what we need to do to get it developed. So they put an application in, the council planning committee might say, no, it's too much harm to the Greenbelt. You don't meet, very special circumstances. We're not allowing you to develop it. Okay, then you amend it. You put 3 affordable housing units on there. You test it again, gets refused, and then you put 5 in. And at some stage you get your permission, this kind of thing. And that just should not be happening. So you've got the companies, Greenbelt owners, and that's anything from schools to universities to the London Diocesan Fund to private owners to councils. Surrey County Council wants to develop one of their sites in Spelthorne Borough Council's review of the local plan. Spelthorne Borough Council, you have all these players involved in this, and they're all set to gain from having their Greenbelt released. So that is hugely problematic. Another thing I like to raise is the narrative then. So you all know a lot more about Greenbelts now than councillors. I mean, I'm sure council officers know, but the majority of councillors will not know what you know now. So when it comes to, I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, well, when it comes to arguing who's responsible for what, the borough councillors will say, mate, it's not my fault, it's the national government. They said that the housing numbers. Sorry, I'm trying, they will say we are the defenders of our Greenbelt, we're the champions for Greenbelt. But in reality, as you've heard today, the legal responsibility and the legal power only lies with local authorities. And if there's a will, there's a way. You can protect your Greenbelt. We've heard it. So it's not someone else's fault, because the figures that are, generated by the standard methodology are a starting point, a policy off figure, as Catriona said. And then you apply your policies and you can get, you might get a 50% amount passed if you try. So there's also no justification for not trying. And as a lot of initiatives in Elmbridge are now, a lot of initiatives in Elmbridge are now putting forward, is to say, yes, but local authorities can develop their own local methodology. And that is true as well. I mean, the housing guidance clearly states, if you can show that there are exceptional circumstances in your area, you can develop your own methodology. And then let's be, creative, let's develop it so it will generate lower housing numbers. Because as Catriona has told me, the standard methodology premise is that if you flood the housing market with houses, that the house price will go down. But we all know this is never going to happen in Surrey. So that's a fallacy and can be evidenced. So, and also the other problem is, of course, and I think that's Chris Packham's point, we're not going to build our way out of the recession, is that a lot of land will just be land banked, because the companies that have then permission, so let's say their Greenbelt site is now a Brownfield site, the last thing they want is for house prices to go down, because that's their big profit margins. So they'll just land bank it. So that's just not, that's not going to help anyone. So, and what I find is really shocking is that residents, as Chris Packham said, it's a much loved resource. If you think about it, no resident really is for Greenbelt release. You're looking at more stress on local services. You're looking at, more noise pollution, less flood defenses, air quality, the view out of your, out of where you live, all this kind of thing, carbon sinks, etc. So who's interested in it? Well, the Greenbelt owners, maybe developers. Some councillors own Greenbelt sites and have personal interests. I'll put a link in. I mean, the cabinet holder for the environment in Spelthorne has his own Greenbelt site and recently put an application in to build on Greenbelt. At every planning application, he votes to release Greenbelt, because we had a planning application at Stratton Road in Sunbury, which in the Greenbelt review, and I don't believe in categorizations, had been designated as strongly performing Greenbelt. Nonetheless, literally the entire Conservative group voted for release. Why is that? You know, I mean, the fact is, of course, if your own greenbelt and other strongly performing greenbelt has been released, you can, when it comes to your application, you'll argue, yeah, but they released that one, so they can release mine. So that's a real problem, that you've got a handful of very strong interests that keep lobbying the council. You know, on local plans, the every 5-year review means that sports clubs and others that own greenbelt sites that think I'm going to have a windfall profit and I can build a whole sports center, or, you know, a university or schools can say, you know what, if we have planning permission of this greenbelt site, we are going to have influx of huge amount of money. They will keep lobbying and they will keep paying consultants. And if you look on your council's website, they should put the answers to planning consultations on there, so issues and options reviews. You should have access. You will see their glossy brochures, their consultancy firms, they are paying out to these firms to make the best possible case. And they're not going to just let go. They will keep lobbying and lobbying and lobbying every 5 years and throughout. And if you don't get greenbelt release in the 5 years, you just hang on for the long game. You just ask in the next local plan. And that's the other point.
Jan,
Open that Pandora's.
Yeah, I wonder if I could.
Just the last point. Yeah, I'm nearly finished. The last point is the issue. When you encroach on the greenbelt, of course, the next line of the greenbelt will be vulnerable, more and more vulnerable to release. So you will get what's known as gateway developments. You will get one greenbelt that's suddenly no longer a greenbelt, and all the greenbelt owners around it will say, yeah, but why not mine? So we need to keep the greenbelt protected and we need to keep it closed. And that means a lot of pressure from local residents, of course, from councillors. But if your councillor isn't representing your interests, then vote like that. As Richard said, stand as councillors in 2 years in Spelthorne, their elections. In Elmbridge, I mean, apart from the 6th of May, but the deadline for standing is closed. But stand, because honestly, you cannot rely on others to do the right thing. And that's just me talking from experience. And then when you all get in, then you get the advice from Catriona, Richard, and others, and you can, when the political will is there, the way is there. But at the moment, the political will isn't there, at least not in Spelthorne Borough Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. And that's a very clear description, really, of real live issues that we're facing here in Spelthorne. I share, you know, I'm in the same borough as Jan, and it's kind of a living example of what we're facing here, really. So it's very useful to see some of the detail in that. I'd like to open the floor now to any points that other participants in this discussion have got, either in response to what they've heard this afternoon, or, you know, on the general issue of green belt and green space. Would anybody like to raise their hand and make a point? But please feel free. And I'm just looking across the screens now. Yes, Vanessa. Make sure you unmute yourself before you talk. You're muted, Vanessa.
Can you hear me now?
Yep,
Hi.
Go ahead.
Hi, Chris. Nice to speak to you again. I just sent a quick message over. Obviously, this is the first meeting I've been involved in, and there are lots of very important issues that were raised, and I feel that it's educated me somewhat. I have to say, as you probably know, I am very passionate about our green spaces and our wildlife. And I am saddened to hear how unimportant it is with regards to development, and that the encroachment on the habitat of our wildlife is not even considered. And I just find that really sad and actually quite annoying, I have to say. It's we really need to think about, and I'm really pleased that I am listening in today, because I certainly will be voting for the Green Party. I find it uplifting that somebody does care about our beautiful wildlife and the habitat around us that we are fortunate enough to still be able to share while it's still here. That's it.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Paul, and then Debbie. Yeah.
Hi there. It's a question for Catriona, really just to get a bit of clarification around the standard method, because that seems to be the thing that a lot of people are talking about at the moment, where councils are being given, and she mentioned it obviously in her presentation. And I understand that the standard method is the government method that's then been issued out to the local planning authorities, upon which to then build their local plan. And I just wanted to get a bit more clarification around, a lot of people have been talking about campaigning to reject the standard method, and whether that is really the right or the best course of action, and whether that can really make a difference to the housing number that is being sought for that LPA.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think there's, when the standard methodology, for those that aren't familiar, is it's called the standard methodology because up until a few years ago, every local authority individually and independently assessed their own housing needs as that starting point for developing their local plan. And so much time was spent at local plan examinations challenging the standard, their own assessment of housing needs. So the government quite rightly said, look, we need a common template for this, so we're going to introduce it nationally and we'll give you your starting point, and then you can apply all your policies and national policies as well. So that's why it came about, and it was a good reason why it came about. Personally, I do think it is flawed for the reasons that Jan said, because I don't believe for a second you could flood the market and bring house prices down in a place like Surrey where demand is insatiable. But I think that ship has probably sailed. I think, I think the most important thing for me is to have a really robust strategy about how you're going to plan for your area and how Greenbelt fits in. For me, meeting housing need is probably the most important thing that we have to deal with as planners. Everybody deserves access to a decent home, and we need to find a way to reconcile that with how we use land. And that's a planner's job. That's what we've got to do. We've got to mediate all the different needs for land and come up with a strategy that is fair and it deals with the big issues like climate change. It does address the green issues, and I think Vanessa, in answer to your question, local planning authorities do have to deal with things like biodiversity and things like that. They just don't do it through Greenbelt, but they do still have to deal with green infrastructure and things like that. So I think issues around nature, biodiversity, wildlife and all that have to still be factored into a local plan. And I think that's an important point. Greenbelt is a different thing, but it is still, all these issues, particularly biodiversity, are becoming increasingly important in the way that we deal with local planning. So Paul, I guess in answer to your question, I would say instead of spending time challenging the starting point, the standard methodology, focus on your strategy and use it as a starting point, and then argue how the housing numbers fit in within that. Because I think anywhere around the southeast, particularly those adjoining London, if they have their own assessments of needs, it will probably end up being just as high as the government set, and potentially there's a risk of it being even higher. And for me, if I was managing my risks going into a local plan examination, I would rather be able to blame the government for their standard methodology and pull back from that than go in with my own standard methodology that is just the same level or near, and then have to argue for delivering less housing. So treat it as a starting point. And I do genuinely think we're spending too much time challenging numbers, their academic numbers at the end of the day. Let's get the local plans right, get the policies right, get our strategy right, and try and deal with land use in a way that is fair, ticks the right boxes in terms of meeting housing needs as far as possible, but does tick all the other needs as well. And that includes supporting economic growth, I'm afraid to say.
Thank you, Catriona. Debbie, did you have a point? Yes, Debbie Long, yeah.
Yes, okay. Yes, us residents, we need to know how to direct our energies. We need more influence in what's going on. We need more say. How can we do that? I mean, besides lobbying the councillors and putting pressure on the councillors, what can we do ourselves as residents to protect these green belts and to, you know, just to protect it and keep it going?
Who would like to answer that? And Richard, you've obviously seen experience of local authorities and resident groups challenging these proposals around London. Is there any words of advice you could offer on that? Actually, I thought your presentation offered some very positive pointers, actually, for things that could be done.
I think the point to make here is that the situation which seems to be most effective is public meetings. I've been amazed at how many people come to public meetings and how many people are concerned. As I say, 400 is quite normal coming to the public meeting. And if at that public meeting a member of the council is there, not the officer, you're not electing the officer, you're electing the councillor. And if the chairman of planning would come or the leader of the council would come, that's very important. I did at one meeting find myself up against the leader of the council, who frankly hadn't been properly briefed. And it wasn't entirely down to me, I can't claim the credit, but as leader of the council, he lost his job soon afterwards. And, you know, this is where councillors start to listen and realise that there's a lot of antipathy to what they're doing. And so I'm a great supporter of that. And I think one of the interesting things which I'd love to have brought out if we'd had more time is one of the most successful authorities is Gravesham or Gravesend in Kent, where there was a fantastic campaign going over about 8 or 9 months to stop them building in the green belt. And they came up with a local plan which didn't allow any building in the green belt. As a result, their standard figure now is so much lower because they got away with a lower figure to start with than everybody else's. And all I can tell you is that that was a major campaign put forward by residents and very well organised. And that was the situation you've got. And unfortunately, the standard figure takes into account often, and nobody really understands the algorithm properly, often it will take into account what you've already been given as a point which is what you've got to produce. And as a result, Gravesham did extremely well on that. But don't tell everybody because I don't want them to lose out on what they've been doing.
So it's basically residents associations getting together, it's citizens assemblies getting together, it's all sorts of different groups putting pressure.
Absolutely. And I found that where this happens, I have to say in the Tunbridge Wells meeting I was telling you about with 400 people in there, the chap who organised that meeting said at the end of it, having asked who thought their local councillor was supporting them, said if we were to put forward our own candidate, how many here would vote for him? And he must have got 350 votes almost straight away. And that really did shake up the council there, which is very good.
Chris, could I jump in there as well? Because I think one of the things we have to reconcile is where the housing goes. And if I was a local resident, I wouldn't just be campaigning against using Greenbelt. I would be trying to offer a solution, because I think too often I hear local residents, and you know, I'm one as well, in an area where the residents saying we don't want you to build in the Greenbelt, but we don't want you to build any more in our towns either. We just don't want more, and that helps nobody, because as I said, you know, we have to reconcile the desperate shortage of housing and affordable housing specifically. So that is not an option. And I have heard some councillors saying, look, your option is build on the Greenbelt or tower blocks. And again, I think we need to be much more honest about what the genuine options are. And I think with climate change and things like that, the role of the Greenbelt actually forcing us to make much better use of existing land, making it look much better, and higher density is not high density, and we need to have a much more honest conversation about meeting housing needs. So if you're going to campaign against the Greenbelt, work with the authorities to come up with an alternative solution, and I think that sort of proactive partnership is far more effective than just having a campaign against something.
Just a word of caution on that, in that if you have a public meeting where you say, well, don't build it here, we want to build it over there, you're going to upset other people very quickly indeed. And that's a real difficulty. The alternative I always put forward is let's have a proper brownfield review. And I couldn't agree with them more, Catriona more, that this business about saying, well, the only way we can do it is by building 20-story blocks is ridiculous. There's plenty of brownfield land around, a lot of car parks, which could be underground anyway, and a lot of areas of industrial use, which is no longer there. And these could make very good, and I showed you some of the examples that Enfield had looked at. But I would caution against saying, well, no, don't build it here, but build it over there, because as I say, you'll upset other people and you might lose some momentum as a result of that.
Could I just as a chair, I mean, I'm conscious Debbie wants to come in, and also Jan. I mean, a thought that struck me during listening to the presentations was, of course, that we have been on the end now of a year of this dreadful pandemic. That is, I mean, obviously during that time, it's very visible, that's having a big impact. But the thing is, this may have a lasting impact on businesses and the desire to actually spend lots of time in office spaces. So one suspects that what is currently office or previously office space may become released. And that, you know, I think underlines what Richard was saying about the need for a refresh of brownfield reviews. And I suspect there may be potential there. I've got another point, but I'll let Debbie come in, and then Jan again.
I was actually, yes, going to repeat what you just said, actually, Chris, because actually, whenever I talk to people about, so they don't want to lose their green, you know, we don't want to, we need houses, and we have to use green belt. Actually, I always suggest, well, there's loads, because of the economic situation these days, there's far more office buildings around available. They've been empty for so long. And also, of course, the brownfield sites, as you said, you know, there are a lot of brownfield sites that need regulating, and we need to find out where they are. I actually did tell Runnymede Council exactly where, you know, what brownfield sites there were available, and I got a list from them. That's at Runnymede. But basically, yes, we need to reevaluate it all.
Jan.
Yes, I think there were really important points raised. I mean, the Spelthorne local plan is a pre-COVID local plan. I mean, it's got a figure in there from office to housing conversions that clearly cannot have stayed the same. You know, I mean, a lot of companies want to get out of contracts, so it's just a question of time. And I mean, I've heard that, you know, companies like John Lewis are now thinking of going into housing. I mean, they're actually discussing it. And other companies, why would they hire or continue to hire office space when A, they've been hit by the pandemic, and B, they've realized that the officers can, you know, that their employees can actually work from home. So no one's going to do that. So it's clear. I find any local authority that holds onto a pre-COVID local plan, you'd think that they're not quite right in their head, would you? I mean, you know, what about that evidence base, etc.? And there I want to ask Catriona, because it's Spelthorne, but I'm sure it's not just Spelthorne that claims it. This idea, yeah, if we don't do it, and Spelthorne is really trying to accelerate and pull through their local plan, you know, push it through, rather than saying, okay, let's hold on a minute, let's just see for 6 months how it goes with office buildings or 1 year. So one of the assertions constantly made was, if we don't get our local plan passed as soon as possible, Surrey or the government will take our local plan powers away. And Catriona, I'd be really grateful if you could address the issues. Is there really an enforcement risk? What's sort of the history behind that? And what do you think would happen to local authorities who said, you know, who have local plans, that pre-COVID local plans that would say, you know what, I want to wait a year or two because we owe it to our residents. We want to make sure the green spaces are protected first, and we want to know for that what's happening to the brownfield sites. Considering also that, of course, local plans are meant to span over a period of time. So this idea of releasing brownfield sites first, greenbelt sites first, and then coming to brownfield sites seems absurd. But yeah, Catriona, I would really appreciate your expertise on that issue of enforcement.
So in terms of how a local planning authority can lose control of their local plan, there's different ways. The main one is Secretary of State intervention, and the Secretary of State can intervene in a local plan probably at any stage, but mainly at the end of the process. And what they can do is ask the relevant county council, as you say, to take over control of it, although that has never happened. But also there has been very, very few cases where Secretary of State has chosen to intervene in a local plan anyway. So the risks of that happening are very small. I think the greatest risk is the local council losing control of land allocations if they don't have an up-to-date plan in place. And I think that's a really high risk if you've got a very old local plan, because developers can win appeals on that. But it's very hard for developers to win appeals on greenbelt land. So I think it's a balancing act for the local authority to think about, does it want to control what happens in its area and have a local plan in place as quick as possible? Or is it going to pause and really reflect on, as you say, what happens as a result of COVID? I think there's room for both. And I think there's room for moving forward quickly with the local plan, but with some very, very strong caveats in it around COVID. But also I think there's issues around permitted development regime, you know, as we've just been talking about, conversion of office space or shops into housing, because we have no idea. The new regime, much more flexible regime, comes in this summer, and we don't know how that will work. We don't know how many new homes will be delivered as part of that. So I think if I was a council, I'd be keeping my powder dry on that one and saying to the inspector, look, we're going to get more housing out of our existing urban areas than we can plan for at the moment, and therefore there's even less of a reason for us to eat into Greenbelt. Give us 5 years, we'll continually monitor the situation, and if it looks as if that housing is not coming forward, then we'll think again through a future plan, a review of the plan. So I think there is an imperative, I think, for local planning authorities to do the responsible thing and get a plan in place, but there also is a very clear responsibility to deal with things like the sort of post-COVID world. They should already have been dealing with things like climate change. For years, they should have been doing that effectively. They should already have been dealing with things like health and well-being and the need to access green space. They should already have been dealing with things like biodiversity and green infrastructure. So these are issues that there is no justification for saying we need to pause and think about that, because these are things that a local plan should already have been addressing.
Thank you, Catriona. Richard.
Yeah, just quickly to add to that, the recalcitrant authorities were basically Thanet, Castle Point, Wirral, and South Oxfordshire. And as far as Thanet was concerned, that was a bit of a basket case at the time. Castle Point, the Secretary of State approached Essex County Council and asked them whether they'd be prepared to take over planning there, and County Council turned around and said no. Wirral, they just left because it's a marginal seat, I suspect, and want to upset the situation there. In South Oxfordshire, again, they approached the County Council, Oxford County Council, who said, yes, they'd be delighted to take over, but could they have several £1 million in order to set up a planning department? So, you know, it's basically, we haven't ever seen that carried out yet. And frankly, I totally agree with Catriona. There isn't the resource to be able to do it, except for spending an awful lot of money. One thing I would add, just to the debate that was beforehand, I attended a very interesting presentation on the future of planning under artificial intelligence. And basically, the idea being put forward is that your office turned into your flat at night. So there didn't need to be 2 spaces, you just had the one. And you wouldn't need a car anyway, because when you needed transport, you just ordered it by phone and just arrived outside the door. So that did away with most of the car parks as well. So that's, it's not going to happen in my day, I'm afraid, but it might well happen at some time in the future.
I'm a big believer in our solutions already available for everything we face. It's just a need of will that's stopping us getting there. I mean, just the only other point I was going to raise was I think it's really the point, really an answer, Richard's answer to Debbie, really, about how residents can get engaged. And I mean, all the highly valuable information that's been shared with us today, it sort of lends itself to something called a citizens' assembly, which is basically a meeting of people, but they need to be properly resourced and they need to be backed up with expertise to ensure that it's all soundly factually based. But then you have discussions with residents, and it would form a basis for allowing participation of residents in an informed way in this whole policy debate. And it also allows the basis for the kind of trade-offs that Catriona was talking about that we do need to face, with a view to coming up with a kind of a thought through plan, which isn't just, defending against something, but actually offering a positive way forward. So I just offer that up as a thought. An assembly, a grouping of people which is well structured and well informed is a way of getting through that. Time is, as a chair, I failed to actually keep us to time. So we're now quarter of an hour past. So I'm looking at probably rounding up now, because I'm sure everybody wants to end their week by having their dinner and enjoying their Friday evening. Just a last call for any final questions from any of the participants here. Yes, Liam.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Okay, thanks. It's just a couple of comments earlier. So you talked about the the question of planning judgment. If they're releasing areas of greenbelt, it's a matter of planning judgment, so it's difficult to actually challenge it. Apart from, I think, what's known as that Wednesbury unreasonableness, which is extremely high bar. But then there was another comment later about, in certain cases, the council own the land, and if the council don't reveal, if they're releasing land they own and are not divulging the fact that they actually own it and have got a financial interest in it, is there a legal case to challenge it?
I can give you an example of somewhere where that happened, which is the Dunham Borough of Redbridge, where there was a sports field there, which the council owned, and they said they wanted to make affordable housing on it. And there was a tremendous campaign in Redbridge because people like Nasser Hussain and Ravi Bopara, the cricketers, and Trevor Brooking had all started playing sport on that field. And they all very kindly allowed us to have statements that we could use in the battle that we had there. And if you work through what the council were doing and how much they were going to get for that field, each plot would have cost £360,000, and that's before you laid a brick. So how on earth was that going to be affordable? It was a ridiculous plan put forward, and luckily the inspector at that open inquiry, the plan inquiry, turned it down, and the playing field is still there, thank goodness.
I think, can I just add to that? I think most councils have Chinese walls should have Chinese walls between the planning side and the sort of the property services bits. So the bits that manage the applications of their own land and things like that, there should be very clear sort of rules in place so that they don't end up.
There's a call for sites process. So clearly the site ended up in front of the planners from their own people.
Yep, and it has happened. It happened in the 90s a lot when a lot of the land, school land, was being sold off and disposed of as well. A lot of that was in greenbelt land. So it does happen. I mean, I think the point about planning judgment is important, because even if it's a planning judgment, you still have to set out what those judgments were. So for a local authority that is determining whether there are exceptional circumstances or not to release greenbelt, it still has to be a visible and transparent thinking process. They have to set out what they took into account, how much weight they gave to different factors. Ultimately, it is up to that council to make that decision. Legally, it is up to that council to make that decision whether there are exceptional circumstances or not, but they still have to have a very justified approach to it, and it all has to be set out very transparently in terms of what decisions they took and how, and what the balance of view was in terms of that. And of course, anybody can come up with a different view. The point is, in law, it doesn't matter if anybody's got another view. The decision maker, i.e. the local planning authority, is legally the one that can make that decision.
Okay, thanks. The problem is, obviously, they've evaluated it against alternative sites that they don't own. So how do you know that that weighed on their mind or not?
It's not so much when you're making a judgment around exceptional circumstances, you don't usually take into account the sites at that point. So it shouldn't impact on that decision. It shouldn't. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it shouldn't.
Okay, thanks.
I think there's something just very briefly to add to that. It's still not understood by the general public. I appreciate what Catriona's saying is what should happen, but it's still not understood. It's the council apparently looking after itself. And I think there's also a misunderstanding on the way some planning officers are interpreting the NPPF, in that they're supposed to be able to assist a developer in getting planning permission. And when the planning permission is in the area of outstanding natural beauty, you wonder what on earth is going on, because the answer should be no right at the very start, and that's an end of it. So that's very misunderstood, and it's sad that some planning officers still feel that they have to help the developer get planning permission.
Thank you. Thank you for the surprise. Jan.
Just Liam, I understand that you also said that the issue, what if a local authority doesn't tell us that their own should answer you when you ask, I mean, I did ask what the Greenbelt owners were for the 19 sites when that came out. And then there was a huge debate. Spelthorne isn't very good complying with freedom of information requests. They did actually provide me with that. But let's say you ask a question, you don't get an answer. I would go to the information commissioner. So you make a question to council to fall under the Freedom of Information Act or data protection legislation doesn't have to specify or refer to that. But you can just, any question just asked in writing, giving your contact details, should actually fulfill that.
But they say it's confidential, sensitive information, and refuse to give it.
I mean, in a way, with the information about who owns what land, I mean, you could go to the land registry, so it's totally public information anyway. So they're just pretending in a way when they say to you, oh, you can't have that information. I would then put a complaint in with the information commissioner, and then they can pursue it sort of further on your behalf to tell your local authority that that doesn't really fall at all under any exceptions. We do have that issue, and I think that's a real problem. I mean, the starting point for any local authority should be that they release information. And again, that this is an exception. Of course, you can't contact your local authority and say, can I find out about, the medical condition of my neighbor? It makes perfect sense. But other questions such as, buildings, commercial properties, etc. I think a lot of local authorities are so keen on keeping everything they're doing absolutely private, when under the legislation they should be releasing it, because it's all about your money. It's taxpayers' money. It's not, their own private money. So I would always go to the information commissioner if you don't feel that you're getting answers to your questions and within the time frames that you ought to be getting them.
I've just put a link in the chat about the ICO making a complaint there.
Can I just come back on that? I think, Liam, keep going at it. Keep going at the various levels that you go at. We have a similar situation in an area of outstanding natural beauty down our neck of the woods, and we asked for it to be called in, and the Secretary of State didn't call it in. We then asked for a copy of the advice he was given by his officers, and it was refused. And then we had a retired solicitor who, bless their cotton socks, had nothing better to do but follow this up, and followed it up. And we got then a redacted copy where it was silly. You couldn't see what on earth was happening. And the solicitor wasn't prepared to give up, very determined. And eventually we got a full copy of the advice given to the Secretary of State. And guess what? It was that he should call it in.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm just looking at the time, and I think probably we should draw this to a close now, as I don't want to keep people any longer. I should say, just a great thanks to Catriona, Richard, and Jan for for your presentations and being with us really, and giving your time up on a Friday evening. And thanks also to all the other participants, all of you, for joining us on this, what I think is a very important issue. And the more knowledge that there is about the planning background, the planning application on this, the better really. So those of you who have joined us in this meeting hopefully now feel much better informed. Just one final point, maybe one for Jan really. I noticed in the chat there was a request for this recording to be shared, and because there were so many points shared there, I think it would be useful to get access to this quite soon. So clearly we need to make some arrangements for sharing the recording on this. I mean, actually, I think this could be shared far and wide actually to great benefit. So once again, thanks very much to all, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris, for chairing.
Yeah, I'd also like to thank the speakers and everyone for coming. And don't forget, there's a panel tomorrow on the global water crisis with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to safe drinking water, the US lawyer Rob Bilott, Kai Gobangbola from Truth or Zane, again addressing both national and local issues. And there's still lots of classes, free classes, part of the weekend. So we'd love to see you at those things, and thank you once again for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.